Hello, everybody. How are we all doing? We're very animated for before lunch. I'm loving it. Hello, everybody. My name is Carly Richmond, and I'm here today to talk about anti-patterns that we see within SRE culture that are really leading to destruction, burnout, demoralization of SREs. Now, we need to know about these things because, as I've found from my varied experience, quite often we learn what not to do from making a whole ton of mistakes. And sometimes people tell us the right thing to do, but it doesn't always work out. So I'm going to talk through several different anti-patterns that I have seen through my career that relate to SRE specifically. So we're going to talk about alerting volumes, not in as much detail as Leon did. So if not, watch back his talk because it was very useful. On-call practices, metrics, code review culture, tooling, testing, very briefly. How we structure our work in terms of tickets and also attending lovely events, which might seem a bit meta, but it's still very relevant from a training standpoint. So first, you're probably sitting thinking, well, why are you the person to give this talk? And it's because I've been there and done all sorts of wacky things in a 13-year career. So currently, I'm a principal developer advocate and as of a few months ago, manager of the advocate team at Elastic. Before that, I worked at a tier 1 investment bank. Pretty much most of the things you can do. I was a front-end engineer. I worked in a team that was working on adopting SRE practices as early as possible and making lots of mistakes along the way with it. But I also progressed to being a manager, progressed through being team lead. I dabbled in agile coaching and I also did Scrum Mastery. So I have a very varied experience that can help with this stuff. Obviously, we will hopefully have time for questions at the end. If not, we can chat over lunch since it's coming up. Or alternatively, catch me on the interwebs. I'm always happy to say hi. So let's dive into the nitty gritty, shall we? So the first thing that I've seen is we suck at alerts. And Leon covered this in far more depth than I'm going to cover in my talk. Tend to send alerts for every minor thing, irrespective of whether it actually does need human involvement or not. And that definitely relates to my initial experience as well. Does anyone still send alerts to inboxes? Okay. A few, not many. Been there, done that, got the t-shirt. Couldn't open up my inbox or Outlook when I got back from maternity leave because the cache was so big. It wasn't just regular emails. It was alerts, trust me. Now, we're really stucky at sending alerts. We don't segregate by environment. We quite often have very different or even the same, which is another opposing problem, thresholds and levels that we use for these things. And it's not great to adopt these kinds of practices because quite often you'll do exactly what Leon said, which is you put filters in your inbox and you never look at these things. If you did try to look at it, you're going to end up in this kind of situation. It looks like everything is on fire, potentially to a new engineer, but it probably isn't. And that's probably because, see the people that are around you that are more advanced and been doing this for longer, they have all these heuristics in their heads that are not written down anywhere that are saying, oh, this one I can ignore because it happens every Tuesday when it's wet. They remember all these kind of things that you haven't been exposed to. It doesn't matter, by comparison, who's centralising their logs in some form of observability provider and not using email as much. Okay, there might be a discussion later on this. One of the things I like about central providers, having been the person that has to log into a box, tail the logs, and then worry why there's only 5 days worth, when I'm trying to find out what happened last week, is everything's in one place, which makes it easier for me to find. But if you're still flooding the thing with alerts, it doesn't matter what the conduit is, because we're still saying, this is fine, and we're still having to learn all of these heuristics as to whether we need to pay attention to this alert or not. Because, as Leon pointed out, we're not using that baseline heuristic of, should a human actually deal with this thing? There's all sorts of domains where we have alerts, and one of the most notable that came well before us in software is healthcare. And in healthcare, you can't have this situation. You can't sit and figure out if that person that's suddenly very quiet for some reason, with all the alarms are going off, with another one where someone is shouting, whether you have to go to that one or that one. It doesn't work like that in healthcare. The general guidance is alerts are for when things are on fire and you actually have to do something, and the rest of the time there should be quiet and silence. And that's how we should be adopting practices as well. Because if not, we're going to end up with burnout from alert fatigue. We're going to start ignoring alerts, or we're going to start diving into them and then feeling a bit frazzled because we can't handle it all. The worst thing is that we're actually showing to these junior engineers that are watching us get burnt out and frazzled that this is okay. And actually, they're now having to pick up these same heuristics in their head that you don't want them to. The things we need to be on the lookout are not just that it's in a central platform, not just that you've got your logs and you're able to access everything, which I've been in desegregated environments and had to elevate to production. Long story. That in an outage situation is a pain in the neck. But what you do need to be able to do is look out for things like false positives, look out for false negatives, and look for flapping alerts. And look for those alerts that people are just minimizing all the time. Because to be perfectly honest, if you're minimizing it all the time, you probably shouldn't be raising it. Now, the next thing we need to think about is on-call practices. So just a quick show of hands. Who has some form of on-call rota in their current role? Does it ever get in the way of other stuff, of balance and having personal time? Yeah, and this is something that hasn't changed. Now, my story for on-call is I used to have a 2-week rota as secondary when I was an engineer. So if I had a bad stint and there was something going wrong, I got pulled in, which meant my primary was also in a state of frazzle, which was also 2 weeks. So I would have a month basically on-call back to back. Then when I progressed to being a manager, I was on escalation and we didn't have a rota for escalation. So I just got called no matter what. And it didn't matter if it was minor or major. It didn't matter if it was a legitimate outage or not. I was just the person to call. To the extent where I was sitting in the delivery suite with a nurse coming in to get the drip to put me on, and someone called me with a question from work on my first day of maternity leave. I'm not joking. This actually happened. This is not okay. What I like to call the Brent effect. Now, I'm not talking about this guy we all know from The Office. I'm not talking about Ricky Gervais. I'm talking about Brent from the Phoenix Project. Now, irrespective of whether you like this book or hate this book, because it's evolving vastly to be the Marmite book of DevOps, the point that you need to take away with it is the character Brent, who's the person that's being pulled into every which direction. He's that guy who has all the information in his head that should be somewhere else. It might need to be in a run book so someone else can perform the steps. Potentially it needs to be in documentation so that someone else can deal with it. Another of Leon's points when it came to documentation was you should say when it needs to call in that appropriate person, and that for every alert he expected a knowledge article. How many of us are doing that now? Not many of us. Quite often we need to think about numbers. Everyone wants a concrete, this is how much time someone should spend on call. Slightly more nuanced than that. So if you look at the SRE handbook, they suggest 50% of our time as SRE should be on engineering activities, because E is in engineering, is in SRE for a reason. 25% approximately should be your time on some form of on-call, and the rest of it is for other stuff. That means when you're not on call, you shouldn't be getting all these ridiculous notifications. So what I've seen in particular in the era of BYOD is it's really difficult to switch off. And some jurisdictions have a right to switch off enshrined in law, and a lot of us don't. I think that means that not only do we have to contend with the notifications of different alerts, we're also having to contend with people potentially sending us messages that we're getting notifications about at ridiculous o'clock in the morning. How many people use this schedule feature whenever they're sending a Slack message? Got a few. Yeah, we need to change that ratio to be more the other way. It takes a minute to think for one moment, what time is it for this person? Is this something that's urgent for them? Now, I'm not saying it's fully your responsibility, it's also theirs. So you need to use something called focus mode, particularly if you're using your own device for your work activities. How many people have focus mode or the focus equivalent set on their phone? More. Thank you. Great. To be fair, this was something I didn't start doing until a couple of years ago. And I really wish I'd done it sooner. Not just because I can switch off in the evening and not get stuff notifications I don't need, but also during the day I can mute particular messages, like the really irrelevant, non-important WhatsApp conversations from your mother, for example. We don't want those in the middle of the workday. The next thing we need to think about is metrics. And sadly, in my Scrum Master hat and my former Agile coaching hat, we tend to think it's okay to use any form of metric that we capture to compare teams, or even if we can try and find a way to break it down further, compare an individual engineer. So the types of metrics that I have commonly seen people try and compare people against or teams against is firstly DORA. Is everyone familiar with the DORA metrics? Mainly nods of heads. I'm not going to cover DORA today. Go look them up. But basically, these are a set of metrics, mainly popularised through the Accelerate book, that cover your ability to how fast you can deploy changes and how fast you can recover in the event of a failure. They're not the only metrics I have seen people compare with, though. Has everyone heard of SPACE? No, that's fine, because I only found out about it recently. I found out recently through an article that we'll talk about in a minute. SPACE are a set of metrics that came from a Microsoft research paper in 2021. Big kind of set of researchers involved in that, including Nicole Ferguson, who was part of the DORA efforts before. But unlike traditional productivity metrics, SPACE framework is more concerned with output of developers more generally. So it covers things like satisfaction, well-being, activity, efficiency, and flow, those kinds of things. But it's not just those. And no, it's not just story points or velocity, which are the other two that I always used to see compared as well. Has everyone seen this piece from McKinsey that came out last year? A few, not many, which is fine because I get it. It's more software developer focused rather than SRE, but the ethos is still very much the same because a lot of the metrics we use are common. So this piece came out from McKinsey last year, making the case that you can use a combination of DORA and SPACE to measure software developer productivity. I'm here to tell you that's garbage. I'm not the only person that thinks this is garbage. These rebuttals in particular, go and read because they're very interesting. But one point I want to put on is Kent Beck's point. It really resonates with the experience I had as well. When we start measuring things, they have this way of getting into all sorts of different performance and measure characteristics for people as well. Things like performance reviews, things like looking at a team's performance. And I'm worried, because there's this new thing that's appeared in the last few years called SLOs, that these are quantifiable measures that if you really go too far, you could start trying to pull any measure into a performance review. You can't compare two teams. I've seen situations where you're trying to use the same set of metrics to compare the team constantly firefighting a legacy application ecosystem with poor testing, very inexperienced engineers who are all flapping about constantly in a panic, and trying to compare that with a set of senior engineers working on a modern microservices architecture with testing best practices, great proper alerting and observability diagnostics. You're trying to compare apples and pears there, so please just don't do it. Compare people over time, track their improvement. Stop trying to use these things to compare teams. Now we need to talk about code review. Does anyone do any form of review or perhaps pairing? Anything at all? Yeah, most of us do. Don't know what it is. I was reading the book Radical Candor by Kim Scott. I'm late to the party. She has an updated forward in the new version, and one of the things she points out that I think is really fair is for some reason people think the term radical candor means it's okay to be a jerk. I would say something stronger. This is a family-friendly show. Is it okay to write something like this in a code review? And this is real, by the way. I was a manager. I had a brand new engineer, had been in my team 3 months, and a senior engineer thought this was okay to write in a code review. I'm sorry, why do I have to state that this is not okay? It's really not okay. This is not encouraging people to get better. This is just destruction for your own amusement and superiority. I'm not the only person that's seen stuff like that, because my wonderful colleague Maha spoke at DevOps UK earlier this year on the same topic. We shouldn't be leaving jerkish personal comments. There's no need for that in a review. There's also no need for that if you're doing mobbing, if you're doing pairing. Just try and keep it empathetic. Also, stop asking irrelevant questions. If it's not related and it's not going to improve the code, maybe park it at home. There's other things we need to think about. We need to give a balance of detail. Quite often, some people give not enough detail, and that doesn't mean write an essay. It means we need to avoid super detailed, irrelevant comments. Quite often I've seen if you don't have agreed standards and checklists, that's where this particular set of toxicity starts to come in. I'm not going to say you're going to document everything, but what you should do is have a set of kind of an ethos of agreed kind of quality and agreement of what things to look for in a review. Because that's, again, helpful for those junior engineers. It's really weird. We don't tend to have a lot on how to conduct code reviews. We just throw people in and expect them to figure it out. And actually, it's quite a nuanced thing. The other final problem, which kind of rolls back to that first quote I had, is quite often we force our own opinions on people. There's a standard in there for a reason, it's fine. I've literally had situations working in a team where someone came in that was a very experienced senior engineer who didn't like the check style that was being used across all of the microservice code in Java, so he wanted to change the specification. Just let it go. It's not worth it. As long as you have a common standard, where the new line is, whether there's a space or not before a bracket, let's just get a grip. It's not worth it. If you're going to keep going down this route, you're probably going to have the situation where people might avoid you for code reviews, or your code reviews within the team might take a lot longer for people to respond, which impacts your throughput and it slows you down. But also, if it gets really bad and you don't have your branches gated anymore, then people will just merge it straight in. And congratulations, you've now got a super failed build because half the test suite's falling apart. Now, we also need to talk about tooling. Now, I'm not going to cover this in super detail because there's a lot of tools out there. I'm not going to give you an opinion of what's the best one because everybody, again, has an opinion about what the best tool is to use. I'm more concerned about themes of tooling and problems that we tend to have. Firstly, why do we keep using very similar tools for the same thing? I spoke about synthetic monitoring and end-to-end testing last year and how I had a story from my own experience where you had SREs working away on building stuff with a Pika and Zebra tester and Selenium, and I'm building the same workflows inside of Cypress. What is the point of that? You can use the same artifact in two places. The other thing we need to think about, which has come in particularly in some of the keynotes this morning, is quite often cost as a consideration. I speak to a lot of engineers who go and say, I don't have a choice. I like using tool X, but I've been told to use tool Y because it's cheaper. That's absolutely fine. The cost does come into it and tooling selection is a criteria, but it also has to, when you're constantly flip-flopping again, that can be a problem. Now, sometimes open standards do help, and OpenTelemetry would be a good example. But to be honest, if you're still hanging around with a deprecated standard, that's going to make the switch even harder. And if anything, you're going to struggle with bigger problems. We're constantly switching between tools. It's a productivity sucker. There's time taken to move your stuff from one tool to another, including data, if that's even possible. There's time taken for the team to learn how things are working in the new tool, and there's time taken to get rid of the old one as well. But there's also a productivity sucker because all of your shortcuts are gone. Your muscle memory for queries and things all disappeared and gone. And you need to spend time learning those. Or sometimes you need to spend time learning multiple things. Elastic has several different query languages in it. Learning multiple, it's a big learning curve for people. We've got to talk about tests. I'm hoping I don't have to have the argument about you need tests. Are we good with that? We're good. We all agree we need tests. Good. Okay. I'm talking specifically about non-deterministic tests. Those ones that were running last Tuesday fine, didn't run properly on the Friday, and then you just reran the CI pipeline and everything was passing again. It's those types of tests I'm talking about. We shouldn't be trusting the struggle and just saying, yeah, I'm going to run this again and go and get a cup of tea. If that's what you're regularly doing, I think you need to look at the wider problem and how much of a productivity sucker this is potentially being for you. When I was looking up this, one of the things I found was the source of flaky tests, particularly in the JavaScript ecosystem, is most commonly coming from concurrency-related issues. That matches my experience with JavaScript, and it matches my experience when I had to dive into the Java flaky tests as well. But the other thing to note is that from a 2017 paper by a prominent academic that I'm not going to try and pronounce their surname, apologies, 13% of failed build and CI pipelines were attributed to be down to flaky tests. If you've got a pipeline you just keep running through, you're saying that the quality of what you're building doesn't matter. You're saying it's okay to spend that extra time going and get a cup of tea so you can rerun the thing. You seem to be so scared about deleting tests. My argument is, and the argument I've seen from prominent people on testing like Trisha G, for example, is see if you've got a non-deterministic test and you keep it in your suite, you're wasting your time. Get rid of it, delete it. Either fix it or delete it. Now, I did say I was going to talk about work items. From my experience as a Scrum Master, one of the bad things we tend to do is we overpack the capacity that people have. And it doesn't matter if it's Scrum, it doesn't matter if it's Kanban. We are constantly packing people with all sorts of work. Now, part of that is down to factors such as we're not estimating things properly, we're not breaking them down, or we're incorrectly sizing stuff, making it too small so that you've got really tiny, nitty-gritty pieces that are just not very satisfying to finish. When we do things like that, we're actually impeding flow. So we've all had that moment of flow state when you're in the zone and you're typing away quite happy and everything is working. You're like, hey, this is great. These kind of things is going to impede developer flow. But the other things I talked about earlier with regards to alerts is also going to do that. Because combined with those things and also those tickets that get stuck in testing phase or get stuck at awaiting user feedback that you then have to juggle along with the other one that you bring in while you're waiting, they're going to maximize distractions, not minimize them. Actually okay to take some space occasionally. This is something that they do at Elastic called Spacetime Weeks, which all the engineers do. And the idea is that people get the opportunity to work on something different for a week, not the usual grind of features and tickets that we normally have as part of a 2-week sprint. These are the things like investigating a new tool that might help you out with a particular problem you're having, tidying something up that's been annoying you no end. These are the kind of things that Spacetime Week is for. And I've done things like a similar on a smaller scale. We used to have mini hackathons for one day in one of the teams I used to work in. And it's nice because people are still working on something useful and relevant, but they get the time to have a bit of a break to sit and maybe mull over some of those problems while they're working on something else. And you'd be so surprised the number of solutions that we had that came out of those little days as well. The last point is very meta, but it's something I've experienced in my career and it really still winds me up. We make it very difficult for people to attend conferences and meetups. Less so meetups because they're the evening and you can't be owned by your employer 24 hours a day. It doesn't work that way. Sometimes we make it difficult for people to attend conferences. We say they've got too much work, there's too many tickets on the board, or there's a sudden outage and they have to leave and come back. Quite often it can be difficult to get sign off for a ticket price. I've seen things like that. I've even had situations where even the fact I had to attend a conference required a level of sign off. We all know that coming to an event such as SREday means that we get the opportunity to learn from all the amazing speakers that take to the stage and show us all these cool tools that we can then take back into our team. But we also have the notion of community and connection. If we're really in a bad team, we find those individuals that maybe can help us secure another job. We can learn from other people's experiences. We can make connections and feel like we belong. This is one of the things that we need to keep ensuring. You might think that someone's wasting and going off on... I used to have colleagues that would say you were going to a conference, going out in a jaunt for a day or two. It's not like that at all because you're coming back with useful things for not just yourself, but the entire team to make things better. We've covered a lot, but if you want to go ahead and destroy an SRE, do all the things that I mentioned and possibly a few more that I can think of that didn't fit into 30 minutes. But basically bombard them with those alerts. Make sure that you're interrupting things for on-call. Think about performance metrics, code review culture, all those things I talked about. Now, if you do that, this is probably going to be the byproduct. You're going to end up the really fed up engineer, potentially someone that lashes out, gets really angry sometimes for like really small things you don't realise. Or it might get worse. They might end up with burnout. They might end up off sick. You don't know. Or they could leave. So let's do the opposite. Let's make sure that we're alerting from legitimate symptoms, as Liam was saying in his talk. Make sure we have balanced on-call. Don't call people when they're on maternity leave. Evaluate performance metrics across time. Don't compare teams with it. Make sure we have a constructive code review culture. Get rid of the flaky tests. Use the right tools. Have space to try out new things. And come to conferences as well. Because at the end of the day, if we really want to build cool stuff and maintain it, we have to look after ourselves and each other, as Jerry said. With that, thank you very much. If you want to see all the resources that went into this talk, the QR code is there. If not, it's time for lunch. Thank you very much.